The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the dry earth in shades of burnt copper and faded gold. Dry Gulch wasn't much of a town. A crooked row of buildings flanked a dust-blown main street, their windows streaked with grime, their signs hanging askew on rusted hinges. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and old blood, and the people who called the place home knew better than to look a stranger in the eye. Today, the stranger wasn't a man. It was a burlap sack, stained and lumpy, tossed like refuse near the splintered post in the center of town square. It twitched once, twice, as though something inside still clung to the idea of moving. A woman, they said. No one asked where she came from. No one dared. Folks here knew there were some things better left unknown. At the saloon porch, a cluster of men lounged with the heavy air of those too lazy or too scared to interfere. Behind them, the piano sat silent, its keys gathering dust. The only sound was the lazy flap of the tattered American flag above the sheriff's office, where the lawman himself hadn't shown his face since breakfast. They came in 2 days earlier, a dozen of them riding hard and mean. The Briarthorn boys. No gang west of the Pecos had their reputation. Led by Morgan Briar, a thick-necked brute with eyes like storm glass and a voice slick with venom, they took what they wanted, burned what they pleased, and left nothing but silence in their wake. Today, their entertainment was the sack. Evening's close. One of the outlaws chuckled, spitting tobacco onto the dusty street. Reckon we string her up soon. A low murmur passed through the townsfolk who dared gather at a distance. Not one of them spoke out. Not old Jeb Carter, who ran the general store. Not Miss Lila from the boarding house, though her knuckles whitened on the edge of her apron. Even Father Callahan, in his threadbare collar, kept his gaze fixed on the church steps. No one knew her name. Some claimed she was a bounty skip from Arizona Territory. Others swore she was the widow of a man Morgan Briar gutted in Wichita. A few whispered she was a witch, cursed to bring ruin on any soul fool enough to pity her. Whatever truth lay buried in those rumors, none had the courage to unearth it. The sack stirred again. A muffled cough, rough and wet, barely reached the ears of those closest. Her hands, tied tight at the wrist, scraped against the coarse burlap as she shifted. No one moved to help. That was when the rider came. From the east end of town, where the canyons yawned wide and the road disappeared into dust, a lone figure on a pale horse appeared. The animal was bone-thin but carried itself with the stubborn grace of a creature too mean to die. The man atop it wore a battered hat, brim drooping low, and a coat sun-faded to a color somewhere between gray and earth. His face was seamed with age and sun, beard stubbled and uneven, his eyes narrow and pale beneath the shadow. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just rode slow down the middle of the street, past the dry goods store, the shuttered post office, and the silent church. The townsfolk watched, some with the faint spark of recognition, others with dread. A few remembered stories. Whispers of a lawman named Elias Boon, a man who'd once tamed bad towns and broken outlaw gangs, a man who vanished after a blood-soaked night in El Paso, leaving behind nothing but bodies and rumors. It couldn't be him. That was a decade past, and men like Boone didn't come back from whatever hell swallowed them. But as the pale horse drew closer to the square, and the stranger's gaze landed on the sack, something in the air shifted. Morgan Briar stepped from the saloon, the sun glinting off the silver handle of the revolver at his hip. His lips curled into a grin. "Well, look what the wind spat out," Morgan drawled, voice thick as creek mud. "A dusty old man come to pay his respects. You lost, Grandpa." The stranger's gaze didn't waver. It held for a heartbeat on Morgan, then dropped to the sack. "What's this?" the rider asked, voice quiet but carrying, a rasp like wind over old stone. Morgan chuckled. "A gift for the evening. Hang her up at sundown. Figured we'd make a sport of it." The stranger dismounted slow, boots touching earth with a heavy, deliberate sound. He moved like a man who knew the weight of every step. "I'll take her," the man said. A ripple passed through the gathering. Some laughed. Others blinked, uncertain they heard right. Morgan's grin widened. "Is that so? And what makes you think she's yours to take?" The stranger reached into his coat pocket. A small, tarnished object landed on the ground with a dull clink. A sheriff's badge, old, battered, edges nicked from too many fights. For what it's worth, the stranger murmured. Morgan's eyes narrowed. He didn't like ghosts, and this one smelled like the kind that came with unfinished business. Tell you what, old man, Morgan sneered. She's yours. But you earn her. Sun's an hour from dead. You make it through what me and the boys got waiting, and you ride out with your prize. Or you bleed into the dirt like the rest. The townsfolk watched, a collective breath held. The stranger glanced at the sack again, at the figure within it that refused to beg, and nodded once. Done. And without another word, he turned and walked to his horse, his shadow long and sharp against the dust. The hush that fell over Dry Gulch settled like a shroud, thick and heavy as the dust rising off the sun-baked street. No one spoke, not even the wind. The pale horse shifted its weight, hooves rasping against the dry ground. The man in the battered had lifted his gaze, pale eyes narrowing as they swept over the line of rough men gathered by the saloon. 12 of them, counting Morgan Breyer. Every one of them a killer. Morgan's smirk returned, a twitch at the corner of his mouth as he motioned for his men to spread out. Rifles appeared from behind barrels and porch posts, the glint of gunmetal catching the last streaks of sun. Well now, Morgan called, his voice slick as oil. You got a fool's courage, I'll grant you that. But this ain't a world for relics, old man. You walkin' in here thinking you can lay claim to something without paying the price. It just ain't how things work no more. The stranger said nothing. He reached a hand beneath his coat, slow and steady, and drew a Colt Dragoon so weathered it might have come from another century. The cylinder gleamed faintly in the dying light. It wasn't fancy, wasn't polished, but it bore the look of a weapon well used, and far too often. A few of the townsfolk shifted behind windows and cracked doors. There was something in the man's stance, the way he held the revolver low, not as a threat, but a promise. A few of the older folk, those who remembered the name Elias Boon, felt a long-forgotten chill crawl up their spines. Morgan spat. All right then. Sun's still got to climb before it quits. You last till sundown. The sack's yours. Hell, I'll even throw in a bottle of whiskey for your troubles. He snapped his fingers. 2 of his men stepped forward, grinning with bad teeth and worse intentions. One carried a whip coiled at his belt, the other a scattergun slung loose in his hands. Neither looked like strangers to bloodshed. Boone didn't move. The man with the whip cracked it once, a sharp report that made the air jump. What's the matter, old-timer? Ain't got the sand to run. I don't run, Boone said, voice even, calm as a man stating the weather. The gunman with the scattergun grinned and leveled the barrel. The first shot split the quiet, a roaring thunderclap that sent birds shrieking from the eaves. Dust and splinters leapt from the saloon post where Boone had stood, except he wasn't there anymore. In the blink of an eye, he'd sidestepped, knees bent, dragoon raised. His return shot came low, a heavy boom that punched through the scattergunner's chest in a red bloom of blood and bone. The outlaw fell backward without a sound, the weapon clattering from limp fingers. The silence that followed was jagged and cold. Morgan's grin faltered. Get him, you sons of whores. The remaining men fanned out, rifles barking, bullets whining through the dusty air. Boone moved like a wraith, his long coat snapping with each step. He ducked behind a wagon, returned fire, and another outlaw crumpled with a hole in his throat. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and past the age where men had any business surviving such odds. But he didn't hesitate. The dragoon cracked again, smoke curling from its muzzle. A shot took one man in the kneecap, dropping him with a scream. Boone's boot crunched down a moment later, a swift, merciless stomp that ended the noise. Miss Lila clapped a hand over her mouth from the boarding house window. Father Callahan whispered a prayer he'd long since forgotten the words to. Another outlaw tried to flank Boone from the alley, but the old lawman spun, caught the glint of steel, and fired. The bullet punched clean through the man's eye, splashing the wall behind him in dark streaks. For down. Morgan's men hesitated now. The legend they'd laughed about wasn't laughing. He was death in faded leather, and he was coming for them. Morgan barked curses, rallying them with promises of gold and revenge, but the hunger in their eyes was turning to fear. They weren't used to prey that fought back. The whip man darted forward, lashing out. The leather tip snapped around Boone's wrist, yanking his arm wide. Before the outlaw could tug the dragoon free, Boone stepped in, used his free hand to grab the man by the hair, and drove the butt of his gun into his face. Bone crunched. The whip fell. A rifle cracked from rooftop. The slug grazed Boone's shoulder, spinning him, blood darkening the fabric of his coat. He gritted his teeth, staggered behind a trough, and reloaded one-handed. 5 rounds left. Morgan's fury boiled over. God damn it, kill him. Another 2 outlaws charged, firing as they came. Boone's dragoon spoke twice. The first man's chest burst open. The second took a round to the gut and collapsed, choking on his own blood. The sun dipped lower. The sky, once a burnt gold, was now streaked with deep purples and angry reds. Shadows stretched long across the street. 8 down. Morgan's breathing came hard now. His confidence cracked. He yanked a second revolver from his belt, sweat shining on his brow. Boone stepped into the open, blood seeping from his arm, dust clinging to his sweat-slicked skin. He looked like hell risen up and walking. Morgan's hand twitched. Boone leveled his dragoon, and from the sack a voice rose, hoarse, raw, and edged in iron. "Leave him." The words cut through the standoff like a knife. Every head turned. The burlap shifted. A slender, dirt-smeared hand tore free, dragging the sack down. The woman's face was streaked with blood and dust, but her eyes burned with a fierce, unbroken light. Morgan snarled, "You shut your goddamn mouth." Boone fired. The slug took Morgan in the chest, just left of his starved heart. He dropped his revolver and crumpled in the dirt, the last light of day catching in his dead eyes. The final outlaw bolted, rifle discarded, vanishing into the gathering dusk. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Boone holstered his weapon, turned toward the woman, and walked to her. He knelt, pulling a knife from his belt to slice through the ropes binding her wrists. "You got a name?" he asked. Her voice cracked, but it carried. "Clara. Clara," he echoed, like testing a word long forgotten. "I'm Elias Boon." The townsfolk crept from their hiding places, faces pale, eyes wide. For the first time in years, Dry Gulch tasted a thing like justice. Boone helped her to her feet. She swayed once, then steadied. "Reckon you belong to no one, Clara," Boone murmured. "But if it suits you, you'll be my wife. My honor." She looked up, fierce and unyielding. "We'll see, Mr. Boone." And together, they faced what remained of the dying day. Dawn came slow to Dry Gulch, the first light slipping over the jagged horizon like a shy thief afraid to wake the dead. The dust in the air hung motionless, thick with the scent of blood and black powder. The town was changed now. The bodies had been hauled out to the edge of the gulch, shallow graves kicked from the hard earth by men who avoided each other's eyes. The bloodstains on the street stubbornly remained. Elias Boon sat on the front step of the saloon, a strip of cloth tied around his shoulder, darkened by seeping blood. He nursed a tin cup of coffee as if it were medicine, eyes fixed on the pale horizon where the desert met the sky. His revolver lay across his lap, cleaned and reloaded, as constant a companion as the beat of his heart. Clara sat beside him, one bare foot resting on the dusty ground, her hands clasped tight around a battered canteen. She hadn't spoken much through the night. There'd been no need. Some things settled in the quiet. The understanding between them wasn't one of frail words. The town stirred behind them, broken and raw, but with a pulse it hadn't had in years. Word had already gone out on the wind. Morgan Briar was dead. Boone had returned, and a reckoning would follow. Boone could feel it in the bones of the earth. Briar hadn't ruled alone. Men like that never did. He was part of a larger, blacker thing, a nest of vipers that stretched beyond Dry Gulch to the old trail towns and the border camps, men who'd branded themselves with violence and fed on the helpless. And those men would come. Boone tipped his hat forward, shielding his eyes from the climbing sun. Clara's voice cut the hush. "How long do you figure we have?" Boone didn't look at her. Not long. It came as no surprise when just past noon, a rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the cloudless sky. A lean man in a duster, his hat pulled low, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. He lingered a moment, watching, before spurring his horse into a canter back the way he'd come. A scout. Boon rose, rolling his shoulder against the tug of the wound. That's our warning. Clara stood, her eyes hard. We leaving? Boon's mouth twitched in something like a grin. We stand. Word spread through Dry Gulch in hushed whispers, passed from stoop to window to stable. The outlaws were coming, all that was left of Briar's gang, and the hangers-on and strays who owed him blood. There would be no mercy in them. No terms. A blood trail gauntlet. The old-timers recognized the name. It meant a slaughter, meant making an example of a place by erasing it from the map. Boon had seen towns die like that before. Smoke on the horizon, ash under the boots of men who cared for nothing but fear. But Dry Gulch wasn't what it had been yesterday. Boon gathered the few who could shoot, Slim Connors from the livery, Widow Haskins with her late husband's double barrel, young Tommy Finch barely big enough to hold a Winchester, and 2 ranch hands from the South Trail whose eyes still carried the glaze of men who'd known real killing. Not much of a militia, but it would do. He paced before them, dragging the butt of his rifle through the dust. They'll come at sundown. That's how these butchers work. Make you sweat out the daylight, then drown you in darkness. Can we hold him? Slim's voice cracked like brittle wood. We ain't got to hold him, Boon said. Just make it cost them to come through. Men like that, you show 'em blood and fight. Half'll turn tail. He looked to Clara. She hadn't left his side since the square. She wore a borrowed pistol on her hip now, hair tied back with a strip of torn sackcloth. Her eyes were steady, not softened by gratitude or fear. It was respect Boon saw there. And fire. Miss Clara's with me, Boon said. If any man's got a problem with that, speak now. No one did. They set to work, fortifying what they could, dragging barrels, overturning wagons for cover, positioning rifles on rooftops. Boon directed them like a man long used to defense in desperate places. He marked the alleys for crossfire and pointed out the killing lanes where the narrow street funneled men into easy range. By late afternoon, the town looked half like a battlefield and half like a dying thing clinging to its last breath. Clara approached Boon as he loaded cartridges into a belt pouch. I'm not leaving this place, she said, tone like gravel. Wasn't asking you to. A pause. You were a lawman, weren't you? Before all this. Boon glanced up. Once. Why'd you stop? He studied the horizon a long moment before answering. World got meaner than my badge. Clara nodded as if she understood. Maybe she did. The sun dipped, lengthening the shadows, painting the world in the same copper hue as old blood. Then they came. First the dust, a low cloud rising beyond the ridge. Then the shapes, a pack of riders, maybe 20 strong, with more coming behind them. Faces wrapped in cloth, guns flashing in the dying light. Their horses foamed at the bit, eager and restless. Boon's hand rested on the dragoon at his hip. When I say, he muttered. The riders fanned out, hooves thundering, war cries breaking the stillness. Shots cracked from the rooftops. One outlaw pitched forward, tumbling from his saddle. A second horse screamed and went down, sending its rider sprawling. Boon fired. The dragoon's report was thunder, and a rider's head snapped back, crimson spraying the air. Clara was beside him, her pistol steady, taking careful aim. The first man she struck tumbled from his horse, clutching his chest. The outlaws roared forward. They hit the barricades like a storm tide, gunfire ripping through the thin defenses. Widow Haskins dropped one at near point blank before a slug caught her in the throat. She collapsed without a sound. Slim Connors fell next, his rifle lost in the dust. But the outlaws were falling too. Boon's people fought with the rage of cornered, every shot deliberate, every inch defended. The streets filled with smoke and screams. Boon moved through it like a grim specter, firing, reloading, dodging into cover. He saw Clara's sackcloth hair tie flutter as she ducked a charging rider and shot him from the saddle. A figure loomed from the smoke, a huge man with a tomahawk and a scattergun. Boon barely sidestepped the swing and drove his knife under the man's arm, twisting. The outlaw grunted, sagged, and Boon took the scattergun. The tide slowed. The outlaws, seeing their easy slaughter become a death trap, began to falter. Boon shouted, "Now, push him back." The townsfolk surged, firing from doorways and alleys. A second rider fell, then a third. The surviving outlaws wheeled, their courage spent. A whip-thin man on a dun horse shouted curses as he bolted for the ridge. Others followed. Boon fired one last shot, dropping the thin man where he sat. Then it was over. The dusk was thick with gun smoke. The town was broken, but it stood. Boon wiped blood from his face, his limbs aching. He saw Clara lowering her empty pistol, eyes still burning. He made his way to her. "You all right?" She nodded. "You?" Boon gave a hollow chuckle. "Ain't dead yet." Around them, the townsfolk gathered. No one cheered. They were too tired, too bloodied. But they were alive. And the threat was ended. For now. Boon met Clara's gaze. "We ain't done. There'll be more." "I know," she said quietly. And they turned their eyes toward the dark horizon, where the trail stretched out like an open wound, and whatever came next waited in its own cruel time. The sun hung low in the western sky, a dull orange disk, sinking into the jagged teeth of the distant hills. Dry Gulch was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not the restful hush of evening, but a taut, breath-held silence, the kind a man felt in his bones before a storm. Elias Boon stood in the middle of Main Street, his revolver heavy on his hip, the stock of his dragoon resting against his palm. The air stank of dust and sweat, of old blood not yet scoured from the earth. The town had done what it could. Barricades of split timber and overturned wagons lined the street. A crude defense, but better than nothing. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted. Every able hand held a rifle, pistol, or rusted blade. It wasn't enough. Boone knew it, and so did they. But no one said it out loud. Clara Hale moved through the barricades like she was born to it. The battered Henry rifle slung across her back, her face streaked with grit. She traded the tattered dress for a pair of canvas trousers and a dust-colored duster that once belonged to her father. There was no trace of the girl who'd been dumped in a burlap sack like discarded meat. Only hard eyes, a loaded gun, and the promise of retribution. Boone met her at the corner by the saloon. "They'll be here before sunset." She nodded. "How many?" "Scouts say at least 20. Could be more." Clara glanced down the length of the street, where men and women took position behind barrels and crates. "We hold them here. It won't be easy." "It's not supposed to be." A flicker of something, admiration, maybe pride, crossed Boone's face, gone in an instant. "Good." The riders came as the sun kissed the horizon, a jagged line of figures silhouetted against the dying light. Dust billowed behind them, a long, tattered veil. They rode hard, weapons gleaming, voices whooping and howling like wolves scenting blood. At their head was a man named Seth Varnish, one of Briar's lieutenants, broad-shouldered and ugly, with a hatchet scar across his throat. He'd come to finish what Briar started. Boone stepped into the center of the street, one hand raised. "You boys lost." Varnish reined in his horse, sneering down at the lone figure. "You're Elias Boon." "That's a fact." "Heard you killed Morgan." "Also a fact." The outlaw grinned, teeth yellow and sharp. "Then I owe you a debt. Collect it if you can." Varnish raised his arm. The riders behind him shifted, weapons drawn. Boone's voice rang out, loud enough for every ear in Dry Gulch to hear. Now, gunfire erupted like a thunderclap. From windows, rooftops, and behind barricades, the defenders of Dry Gulch unleashed a storm of lead. Horses screamed. Men toppled from saddles, twisting in midair. Clara fired from a second-story window, dropping one rider clean off his mount. The air filled with the acrid stink of gunpowder and the sharp, metallic scent of blood. Boone moved like a man 20 years younger, his dragoon thundering in his fist. Each shot placed with ruthless precision. He dropped a man charging the saloon, then spun to get another who'd made it past the barricade. The years of wandering, of burying his past beneath whiskey and dust, fell away with every pull of the trigger. The outlaws pressed hard, swarming the barricades, tossing firebrands and shoving through gaps. Varnish howled curses, rallying his men. A burning wagon crashed into the fence line, near the general store, the flames licking high. Clara was there, kicking it aside, slapping down the blaze, with a damp canvas before it spread. They fought yard by yard, house by house. The town became a knot of smoke, fire, and noise. Every man and woman knew the cost if they failed. There'd be no mercy. Boon caught sight of Varnish cutting through the melee, 2 revolvers blazing. Boon vaulted a water trough and barreled toward him, shouldering aside an outlaw with a Bowie knife. Varnish saw him coming and grinned, spurring his horse forward. The collision was ugly. Boon fired once, the shot catching Varnish's left shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The outlaw hit the dirt hard, rolled, and came up bleeding, a knife in hand. Boon didn't hesitate. He charged. The fight was brutal, neither man giving ground. Varnish slashed Boone's arm. Boon drove a fist into his jaw. They grappled in the dust as gunfire rattled around them. Finally, Boon wrenched the knife away and buried it deep in Varnish's chest. The outlaw gasped, a last ragged breath, and crumpled. Boon staggered to his feet, blood streaming from a gash at his temple. The fight around them faltered. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, broke. Some fled for their horses. Others dropped weapons and bolted into the dusk. Clara's voice cut through the fading chaos. "Run, you bastards!" A ragged cheer rose from the defenders. Boon turned, his vision swimming, and saw Clara standing in the street, rifle raised in triumph. The town was battered, bloodied, but it stood. It was over. Boon limped toward her. "You all right?" "I'll live." She eyed the fleeing riders. "They won't be back." "No," Boone agreed, "but others might." Clara gave him a crooked smile. "Let him come." Night settled over Dry Gulch, a heavy, bruised sky littered with stars. Fires were doused, the dead gathered, wounds tended. There would be more battles. Out here, there always were. But for now, in this blood-soaked corner of the frontier, justice had been carved out with bullets and grit. Boone knew they hadn't just survived. They'd made something. A story, a name, a legend. And legends, like Dry Gulch, were built on blood. Morning came slow and raw, like a sore muscle stretched too soon. Dry Gulch lay in uneasy quiet, the kind that settles after thunder, when the land itself seems to hesitate before breathing again. The streets were littered with spent shells and blood-darkened dust, smudges of crimson marking where men had fallen. Smoke clung to the air, stubborn and metallic, a scent no amount of wind could scrub clean. Elias Boon walked the length of the main street, his boots scuffing the ground, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. Every step ached. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet wound tugged like a dull toothache. But he kept moving, kept scanning the town, as if expecting another rider to crest the ridge. The townsfolk were out now, faces pale but eyes sharp. Widow Haskins' body had been buried at dawn alongside Slim Connor's and the others who hadn't made it through the night. The grave sat at the edge of town beneath a twisted juniper tree, fresh mounds of earth like unfinished thoughts. Clara waited near the well, a battered carbine slung over one shoulder, her face streaked with soot. She watched Boone approach, her expression unreadable. She looked like someone carved from the very land itself, hardened, stubborn, impossible to bend. The townsfolk had begun speaking her name in low, uncertain tones, not out of pity now, but respect. It clung to her like dust. Boone stopped in front of her. "We held." "We did," she said. Her voice was rough, but steady. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them buzzed with the cautious hum of rebuilding. Broken fences were mended, bodies buried, bullet holes patched. It was a ritual as old as bloodshed itself. The way frontier towns scraped themselves off the floor after calamity and braced for the next. Boone finally tipped his hat back. "They'll talk about this." Clara raised a brow. "Talk about what?" "That we survived a pack of drunken killers, with a handful of farmhands and a couple of rusted rifles." He gave the ghost of a grin. "Exactly that." Word traveled fast in places like this. Already, Boone could feel it on the wind, the way whispers took on a life of their own. There'd be stories. That Dry Gulch had stood against the blood trail gauntlet and lived to tell it. That Elias Boon, long thought dead, a man with a past steeped in blood and ruin, had returned when it mattered. And Clara, the girl in the sack, the woman who had risen from dust and shame, gun in hand, to claim her place among the living. Legends didn't need to be neat or true. They needed only a heartbeat and someone to believe them. The town's preacher, old Josiah Crane, approached with a wary nod. He still wore his funeral coat, black as midnight, though it was frayed at the cuffs. "Boon," he rasped, voice dry as river rock. "There's talk of more coming. Some of Briar's men, scattered from other towns. They might ride this way looking for what's left." Boon glanced at the horizon. "Let him come." Crane swallowed. "And if they do, the town ain't got much left to fight with." Boon looked to Clara, then back to the preacher. "Then we fight with what we've got." Crane hesitated. "You'd stay." A long breath escaped Boon, like a man making peace with something heavy. "I'll stay, long as I'm needed." Clara crossed her arms. "Me too." Crane seemed to shrink, the weight of the decision lifting something from his shoulders. "Thank you," he murmured, and drifted away. Boon turned to Clara, the weight of his words sinking between them. "Didn't figure on finding something worth standing for in this hellhole. You saying Dry Gulch is worth saving?" He shrugged. "Maybe not the town, but the people." She gave a small nod, and the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips. The days that followed moved slow, stitched together by hard work and scar tissue. Boon took to patrols at dusk and dawn, his rifle across his knees, his gaze pinned to the endless horizon. Clara worked alongside the others, repairing shutters, fortifying fences, and training those too young or too old to fight, but willing to learn. She was no longer the girl in the sack, not in the eyes of these people. She was Clara Hale now, and if anyone needed reminding, she kept her pistol tied low on her hip and a knife in her boot. Boon knew what was coming. The frontier didn't forgive. It didn't forget. Men like Briar didn't crawl out of the earth alone. There were others, darker things with deeper scars and meaner hearts. They'd hear of Dry Gulch, and curiosity or pride or greed would draw them. But Dry Gulch would be ready. It was near a week later when the first outsider arrived, a weathered cowpoke with dust in his beard and a revolver on each hip. He rode in slow, eyes scanning the rebuilt barricades and wary townsfolk. He dismounted by the well and spoke low to Clara, asking if the stories were true. She pointed to Boon, who sat carving a piece of wood on the saloon's porch. The man approached, his gaze guarded. "You Boon?" "Depends. They say you killed Morgan Briar. That true?" Boon didn't stop whittling. "I did." The stranger nodded, the sort of nod men gave when testing the shape of their own courage. "Good. Man like him needed killin'. You here to pick up where he left off?" The cowpoke grunted. "Hell no. Here to ride with ya. Heard you might be needing hands." Boon studied him a beat, then gestured to a spot beside him on the porch. "Grab a seat." The man did, and by nightfall, another pair of riders came. The day after, 2 more. Word had spread, just like Boon predicted. But it wasn't just the wrong kind of men coming. It was the other kind, too. The ones who'd lost towns and families to the blood trail gauntlet. The ones looking for a fight. The ones eager to ride under a man with a dragoon and a name that carried weight. Dry Gulch, forgotten and broken, was becoming something else. A rally point. A warning. Boon knew it couldn't last. Nothing ever did out here. But for the first time in years, there was a thread of hope, frayed and thin, stretched taut across a raw and unforgiving land. And for now, that was enough. As the sun dropped behind the hills and the sky bled orange and purple, Boon looked out across the desert and spoke soft to no one in particular. Legends don't start easy. They're born in blood and dust. Clara stepped up beside him, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "Then we've got ourselves the makings of a damn fine legend." Boon smiled, the lines of his face deepening. "That we do." The wind stirred the dust at their feet, carrying the promise of what was coming. And when it came, Dry Gulch would be ready.